Okay, we'll start with this. I'm sure most of you have heard by now.
Eddie Hearn tweeted,
"Welcome to the team, Frenchon Cruz and Aline Cederroos. Delighted to have signed for the undisputed fight in spring of this year. Fight date dropping soon," to which Frenchon Cruz herself took to social media and stated, "Thank you, Eddie." It appears that Eddie Hearn and Matchroom have salvaged the undisputed super middleweight title fight that was supposed to go down on the undercard of Lopez versus Kambosos Jr. back when Triller had the rights for the fight. But we know that Triller ended up defaulting. We know that Matchroom ended up
as the second highest bidder
in that highly publicized purse bid. Once Triller defaulted the rights, Matchroom, as the second highest bidder, won the rights for the fight. But I noticed that Frenchon Cruz versus Aline Cederroos did not stay on the program, which was unfortunate.
Things went quiet for a while.
And I wondered if the fight would materialize at all. I wondered, what exactly is the relationship between Frenchon Cruz and Golden Boy Promotions, who up until recently was her promoter? What's that relationship like at this point when
they weren't going to be the lead promoter for this fight?
Back when Triller had the rights to it, and they didn't seem to have any intention of staging it on one of their own shows, one of their own cards by way of DAZN.
Neither Frenchon or the fight seemed like that high of a priority to Golden Boy.
Which was a great pity to me because it's an excellent fight between two very excellent fighters. Two of the somebodies in the super middleweight division.
Both of them unified champions.
And what this move essentially communicates to me is that Matchroom's interest in developing the sport of women's boxing is not exclusive to what they can do for UK fighters.
As if that wasn't obvious enough in them signing Alicia Baumgartner.
Matchroom's commitment to growing the sport of women's boxing transatlantically is evident in them signing Alicia Baumgartner and them picking up this fight and signing these two fighters as well, because Matchroom knows this is the most relevant fight in the super middleweight division. This is the fight to make.
And believe me when I tell you, it's going to be a good fight.
What this move essentially communicates to me is three things. Three things primarily. Matchroom is more committed to seeing this fight happen than Golden Boy Promotions was.
That's one.
Matchroom's interest in growing the sport of women's boxing is not exclusive to the UK boxing scene. They want to spark a renaissance here in America as well by signing American talent and making important fights happen.
That's two.
And three, which isn't as obvious, this move could see former unified middleweight champion Christina Hammer having to cross over to the Matchroom DAZN side of things for opportunities. Christina Hammer, who very recently signed to Wasserman Promotions, they're going to be behind her from here on out. That was a signing that took place late last year.
And she's boxed at least once under the banner.
But the way this breaks down, both Frenchon Cruz and Aline Cederroos have signed to Matchroom for this fight. And the full extent of that signing is unbeknownst to me at this time, though I get the sense that the winner, regardless of who it is, moving forward, will be a Matchroom fighter.
Whoever ends up with all of those belts.
I get the sense that if Christina Hammer wants a piece of that action, she's not going to have much of a choice. She's going to have to cross over to the Matchroom DAZN side of things for at least a one-off situation to box against the winner of this fight.
Which is an interesting situation in and of itself.
I mean, it's either she goes after the winner of this fight at 168 pounds, or she returns to the middleweight division where she reigned as a unified champion for some years and sees about facing the winner of Marshall versus Shields.
Both of which are signed to Sky and Boxer.
I mean, one way or another, Christina Hammer is going to have to cross some streets in order to box for an alphabet title, whether it's at middleweight or super middleweight. It has to happen. In reference to this fight between these two world champions, Aline Cederroos is much better than advertised. She took me by surprise because I actually picked Alicia Napoleon to beat her well over a year ago.
And what was their unification match?
Real problem is, that unification match took place in January of 2020, before the pandemic hit, before everything got shut down, and that was the last time that Aline Cederroos saw any action. Now, if you follow Aline by way of her social media, you'll know that she's a bit of a fitness nut. She keeps herself up very well between fights. Though better still, there really is no substitute for having to perform under the hot lights, and Aline hasn't had to perform under the hot lights since January of 2020.
We're in January of 2022.
Aline Cederroos hasn't fought anybody in 2 years. Something similar applies to Frenchon. Frenchon hasn't fought anybody since January of last year, so in that way, Aline's coming off of 2 years of inactivity, and Frenchon is coming off of 1.
You gotta give French on the edge here, though.
And it's not just because Frenchon's been a little bit more active effective than Aline, it's because of Franchon's amateur background. You know, Aline Cederroos crossed over from a different sport.
Franchon came up in the amateurs with Clarissa Shields,
Michaela Mayer, Marlene Esparza, Raquel Miller,
Christina Cruz.
Franchon Cruz has the amateur pedigree that Aline Cederroos doesn't have, with the same kind of professional experience. They're both unified champions.
Aline Cederroos has a very upright European style.
Franchon is a little bit more nuanced, and I'd wager that Franchon Cruz's looping right, that overhand right, that homing missile, it would find a home quite a few times in this Aline Cederroos fight, because I reiterate, Aline Cederroos has a very upright European style.
I don't want to get ahead of myself.
The fight is on, and an official fight date is pending, and we'll get into a full fight breakdown as that fight date approaches. For now, my reaction to this news is it's excellent. Fucking excellent that Matchroom was able to swoop in and save the day and salvage this excellent fucking fight. In other news, per tweet from Michael Benson, I'm sure most of you have heard by now that Joseph Parker has rejected the IBF final eliminator against Filip Hrgovic, according to Hrgovic's team. They will continue to go down the IBF's rankings, trying to find someone who will accept. So Joseph Parker is just the latest guy, more proven guy, at least than Filip, based on resumes, based on what's on paper. He's just the latest guy, like Luis Ortiz before him and Michael Hunter before him. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it's about time somebody called the Ghostbusters, because we seem to have a boogeyman on our hands, and I don't want to oversell the fighter. I don't want to give him a massive vote of confidence based on anecdotes and fights that haven't happened, fights that haven't taken place. Though if those fights haven't taken place and aren't about to, it's because these guys keep partying around Filip like a river around a rock.
Even though on paper they're more proven fighters than he is.
In Michael Hunter, he shared the ring with anyone from Alexander Usyk to Alexander Povetkin to Alexander Ustinov. The great Luis Ortiz, he fought Deontay Wilder 2 times. More recently, he knocked Charles Martin's block off, but he ain't got no time for Filip Hrgovic. Oh, that's right. He's injured. That's his excuse. Joseph Parker, he can't say the same. We know of no injuries that Joseph Parker sustained after that Derek Chisora fight, that Derek Chisora rematch. No injuries were reported, and yet he's gone the same route that Luis Ortiz has gone, and you have to wonder if Joseph Parker isn't interested in fighting in an IBF final eliminator that could get him a crack at the winner of Usyk versus Joshua 2. If he's not interested in that, what is he interested in? Who is he going to fight?
Does this guy want to fight for a world title or not?
There aren't exactly that many safe choices out there for Joseph Parker at this point. Not at this level. By way of the IBF, he'd have to go through Filip Hrgovic. By way of the WBO, he'd have to go through Joe Joyce. There is Trevor Bryan, WBA regular champion, by way of the WBA, holding the secondary version of Alexander Usyk's title. There is Trevor Bryan to consider, but when you consider that Joseph Parker is not even ranked in the WBA's top 10 ranked standings, he's not. In their last set of updated ranked standings, Joseph Parker's all the way down there at 14, with a whole heap of guys ahead of him in the queue.
Trevor's a safer choice than those other guys.
He might be, but I don't know that Joseph Parker has access to him at this time.
I mean, something's got to give.
You know, it's not like Joseph Parker isn't getting out there and fighting the fights. He actually is. He fought 3 times last year. You do realize that, right? He started the year off with a fight against his domestic and amateur rival, Junior Fa. He won that fight. He went on to face Derek Chisora 2 times, all last year.
He fought in February, then in May, then again in December.
And he showed legitimate improvement the last time out from when last we saw him in that first Derek Chisora fight. He seemed a lot more switched on in that second fight.
But what are you supposed to say to this?
What are you supposed to call it? Should we expect to hear that Joseph Parker has suffered some kind of a convenient injury, the same way that Luis Ortiz did post-fight when faced with Filip Hrgovic? Is that what we should expect to hear? Because it's a little bit too convenient for me.
It's a duck. It's a fucking duck.
Who exactly is Joseph Parker going to fight if he's not going to fight Filip Hrgovic? You turn that fight down, that opportunity to become the IBF's mandatory challenger, the IBF that you know takes their mandatories very serious.
You're turning down Filip Hrgovic to fight who?
Can't be a Dillian White rematch. Dillian White's all tied up with that WBC situation, trying to get Tyson Fury in the ring.
Get a halfway decent split at the same time.
When you're 1 fight away from fighting for 3 out of 4 alphabet titles against the winner of Joshua versus Usyk, whoever that winner turns out to be.
Listen, I don't want to oversell Filip Hrgovic, but he seems to have a lot of people spooked.
Many of these proven fighters have decided to go in the other direction when facing Filip Hrgovic. Michael Hunter, Luis Ortiz, now Joseph Parker. Who's next? A trip over to the IBF's ranked standings reveals that behind Joseph Parker is Anthony Joshua. And it's not likely that Anthony Joshua fights Filip Hrgovic next because Anthony Joshua, former unified heavyweight champion Anthony Joshua, has exercised his rematch clause.
He's fighting Usyk again, and everybody knows that.
Tony Yoka, he was supposed to be fighting Martin Bicoli in the very near future, but that fight got postponed due to COVID restrictions and protocols, and I have no doubts that that fight isn't canceled outright. I believe that fight will be rescheduled for a later date. Thus, Tony may not be available to box with Filip either. Behind
Tony Yoka is smoking Joe Joyce.
I don't know. Filip Hrgovic has a cushy spot by way of the IBF. Joe Joyce, he's got a cushy spot by way of the WBO. And in an ideal world, these two guys would be mandated to fight each other by both sanctioning bodies so that a joint mandatory between them can be crowned. I think that's what would make the most sense, though even with that, there's no guarantees that Joe takes the fight.
Nah, Joe had some big announcement he was going to make before he got injured.
The announcement never got made. The announcement as far as who it was that Joe was going to be fighting, the announcement itself ended up being that Joe's not going to make an announcement because he's injured. But it seems to me that they knew who Joe Joyce was going to be boxing in his very next fight. And you know, I don't think that Joe's worried about Filip Hrgovic, perhaps not Joe Joyce himself, but his handlers, they might look at that fight as a high-risk, low-reward fight. Why take a chance on Filip Hrgovic when you're already
in a pole position to get a title shot by way of the WBO?
So I don't think that Joe Joyce will be the next guy that Filip Hrgovic fights. Behind Joe is Germany's own Agit Kabayel, unbeaten Agit Kabayel, who, you know what? Maybe he'll take the fight if the price is right.
I don't think it's going to be Gassiev because he just pulled out injured.
Pulled out of the Rudenko fight. It's obviously not going to be Luis Ortiz because he passed on this opportunity right before Joseph.
I don't think it's going to be Andy Ruiz, because I think he's going to fight Ortiz.
There's Australia's own unbeaten Dempsey McKean, who just signed promotional deal to Matchroom. He's one of several Australian fighters that Matchroom will be working to develop in the future. And I don't see a fight between Filip and Dempsey McKean, who literally just signed to Matchroom. I don't see that happening.
The IBF might have to just promote Filip to that position by default.
If the IBF can't get anybody in their top 10 and top 15 ranked standings to accept this fight and accept this final eliminator, they might have to just promote Filip Hrgovic to that position by default. Crown him the mandatory since nobody wants to fight him.
As a last resort, that's the only solution.
We've already got 3 very experienced fighters who didn't want nothing to do with Filip Hrgovic. They didn't want to know. If that many more fighters pass on this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, it's safe to say that Filip Hrgovic is the heavyweight division's boogity man. And finally, in light heavyweight news, reigning WBO light heavyweight champion ahead of his upcoming title defense against the UK's own Callum Johnson, Joe Smith Jr. says, at this point, everybody would choose the Canelo Alvarez fight just because there's money to be made there. But really, for my legacy, I want to be known as a great fighter. So I would like to fight Artur Beterbiev and Dmitry Bivol. Said this to Brian Custer on the Last Stand podcast, and it all sounds very wide-eyed and
I mean, it's almost hard to believe.
The reason for this is those are all great fights. Joe Smith Jr. versus Artur Beterbiev, perhaps a rematch with Dmitry Bivol. Excellent fights, great fights. Though none of those fights would provide Joe with life-altering money, win or lose, the way the Canelo Alvarez fight would, the same way that that fight would. And it's for this reason that these comments are almost hard to digest.
Hard to believe.
I'm not complaining, and I'm certainly not lambasting Joe Smith Jr. for saying as much. I'm just saying that it is a little hard to believe when more often than not, that's not the mentality you see in association with a potential Canelo Alvarez fight. You see a lot of guys that are more than ready to put their entire careers on hold for the chance to win the sweepstakes. And Joe Smith Jr. is saying that he's not going to do that. In truth,
it's not up to Joe, and it never was.
Just being honest, if Canelo Alvarez were making hard inquiries into a Joe Smith Jr. fight, I think Joe Smith Jr. and his team would be more than receptive to just such a fight. But at this time, I don't get the sense that Canelo is making hard inquiries into a Joe Smith Jr. fight. So Joe Smith Jr. and his team...
Well, they're not going to lose time on an opportunity they don't even got.
An opportunity that they don't even have. I mean, right now, they're already booked to face Callum Johnson in a matter of weeks.
And really, that's what they got to focus on.
You can't bank on Canelo Alvarez being your next fight after that. that, because who knows what the hell that guy's going to do. For better or worse, Canelo Alvarez moves to the beat of his own drum, does what he wants to do, and that's the way it's been for the longest time. And it's for that reason that you can't bank on him being your next fight. So you got to proceed as planned.
The plan seems to be to face Artur Beterbiev after the Johnson fight.
Now, I maintain my original position. If sometime between now, the Callum Johnson fight, or after that fight, Canelo Alvarez starts making hard inquiries into a Joe Smith Jr. fight, we might see Joe have a change of heart. We might see Joe shift his focus and change his mind, focus on a Canelo Alvarez fight. That's if Canelo really wants that fight.
But until they're making hard inquiries for a Smith fight,
you can't hold up your own career waiting for Canelo Alvarez. At this time, Canelo Alvarez's very next move seems very immaterial to me. It seems like that Lunga Makabu fight, that potential fight that was proposed weeks ago, it seems like whatever buzz was around that fight has all but dissipated. Not sure if that's what Canelo Alvarez really means to do in his very next fight. At this time, I'm not even sure a light heavyweight campaign is what's next for him. He may decide to stay at super middleweight a little while longer and defend that undisputed crown against the Jermall Charlo.
I'm just saying, nobody really knows what the hell Canelo Alvarez is going to do.
So you really can't base your next move on his next move. If the plan was to face Artur Beterbiev after Callum Johnson, you stick to that plan until Canelo gives you a good reason, a real reason, to change the plan.
And I like that plan anyway.
Smith versus Beterbiev, or if by some chance Canelo Alvarez actually does want a Joe Smith Jr. fight, Smith versus Canelo, while Artur Beterbiev maybe faces Dimitri Bivol. I like that plan too.
That scenario, I should say.
It can break down a lot of ways, but if what Joe Smith Jr. is saying is that he's not gonna hold up his own career waiting for a Canelo Alvarez fight, you know what? I'm not against those statements.
Not against that mentality, because it makes for great fights.
So speaking of great fights, Joe Smith Jr. may have a decent-sized fight right in front of him with Callum Johnson. So let's not spend too much time focusing on other guys.
Right now, he needs to focus on his Callum Johnson.
Because if he don't make it past Callum Johnson, those other guys and those other fights don't even come into it.